Clear? Can I go on? Okay, so the recording has started. Good morning. I'm sorry. Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon. So I'm very happy to see quite a good number of people here. So today I'm going to talk to you about law and policy. So the format is going to be the same that other speakers have followed, which is it's going to be about 30 minutes of a talk. So I will try not to make it like a lecture because I also want you to, in a certain sense, get some sort of real life experiences as well out of this. Before I begin, my name is Kaveri. I teach at JSGP at the Jindal Global University. I have quite a mixed background, you can say. Um, I had I have a background in law, and after doing my law, actually, I must be very honest. I come from a family of lawyers, so there was a lot of talk within our family circles about law, and my uncle was a practicing lawyer. My great grandfather was a very well-known, reputed lawyer. So I grew up thinking that this is really the profession that I want to be in. I guess some of you will probably also understand when you grow up in a certain atmosphere, you're also, imbibing those values within that atmosphere. So I was very fascinated also with laws. I used to read newspaper articles, and I would follow some of the important case laws that were taking place during that period. My grandmother, who was also very interested in legal debates, used to tell me a lot about what happens in court. And my first introduction to the Constitution was over dinner and lunch conversations. So it was a very natural choice for me to make. I graduated, I got out of school. The choice was between arts and science. I took up arts with the idea that I would do law. And I went on to work with the Advocate General in the state of Karnataka for a few years. And then realized that I really wanted to do something to contribute to society. I felt very frustrated. I would constantly go to courts, and there would be constant adjournments. Frequently, there would be actually nothing really would happen except suddenly one off case where I would really make progress, and I would argue the case out, and I would get a judgment on behalf of my clients. What also happened at that point of time is because I was working with the Advocate General, he was representing the National Human Rights Commission. So I was very fascinated with the world of human rights, and then went on to work. I left the law field altogether, went on to work with Indra Jaising in her women's rights initiative, Lawyers Collective, where I then began to work on a research project on cruelty towards women. It was Section 498A of the Indian Penal Code, which specifies a law against cruelty towards women. So the question that I was researching was, what is really mental cruelty? And we did a bit of a project on mental cruelty with NIMHANS, the National Institute for Mental Health and Neurosciences, trying to understand how women experience what is mental cruelty. Is it just verbal abuse, or is there more to it than that? Because different people take verbal abuse in different ways. From I might actually shrug off verbal abuse, somebody else might take it a little more seriously. So we worked on a project on that, and I learned a lot about laws during that period too. And I found that work also a lot more interesting. But what I realized during that time was that I had a marked interest towards issues that pertain to poor women, poor people, poor people who comprise about 20 to 25% of India's population, the poorest, most vulnerable people. And at that time, I decided to apply for a master's. I applied for a master's in development studies in the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And I was lucky. I got a full scholarship. And after that, I applied for a PhD in development studies because I was thoroughly engaged in the academic field. I was very interested in reading, research, writing of various sorts. So I went on to then finish my PhD in development studies. I got a fantastic grant from the Swiss government, which covered not just my tuition fees, but covered all my expenses. I was getting more or less sort of a salary. So it was a fantastic way of actually completing my education abroad in an excellent, in one of the top development schools in the world. With a very ample, very comfortable funding. I realized actually during my work with Indira Jaising that I was very interested in research and writing, and that's how I decided to move into academics, and I don't regret that decision. I enjoy research as well as writing. I've written primarily on topics concerned with poor people. I've talked about women's struggles, poor women's struggles. Some of you can check up. I don't know how many of you actually go on to scholar.google.co.in. It's the other Google. It's the Google that people like us, the ones who are academically inclined, actually go on to and check up some of our academic works. You will find my profile there. I generally write under the name Kaveri Tara, so you will find a good number of articles if you're interested. Take a look if you have the free time. So today we are talking about law and policy. It's interesting how things have come a bit of a circle for me. I started with law and then moved away from law. I went to development issues. I looked at poverty. I looked at women's rights issues and then poverty. And then now I'm back at JSDP teaching law and policy. So one of the courses that I'm going to be offering next semester, I offer two courses. One is on gender and development. The other one is on law and public policy. So today's lecture, not really lecture, I would say a little bit of an introductory talk is going to be on what is law, what is public policy. So before we get into law, I think law, many of us know what law is. So today I'll try to disturb some of your understandings of what law is. But let's begin with policy. What is policy? What does one mean when somebody says this is public policy, right? All of you have applied for a master's in public policy. What is public policy? Public policy is essentially the government's approach to any given public issue, right? So let me give you an example to help you understand what public policy is. The government looks at certain, the government is governing all of us, right? All of us are governed by the government. The government is ensuring that, one, that we are well educated, two, that we are productive, that all of us have jobs. So if there are not enough jobs, then there is a problem with the government, meaning that the government has not provided the right environment for all of us to have jobs. So a human being needs to have sufficient food, nutrition, shelter, but a human being also needs to have education. A human being also needs to have work, because all of us fulfill ourselves through work. Work is a very important facet of our life. We also need to have adequate access to resources. For instance, everybody should be able to have access to the right nutritious food, the basic diet that is needed. And if there is starvation, or if there is there are problems, if there are children dying of starvation, for instance, then that means that the government is not doing sufficient to govern us. So the responsibility of the government, in a certain sense, is to ensure that all of us are healthy, that we have all of those things essential to lead a proper human life, right? So when the government governs us, it's also governing different groups of people, right? For instance, I'm a middle class person. I'm not the same as somebody who's very poor. So the way in which the government will deal with me will be very different from the way in which the government will deal with a very poor person. One recent example is the COVID example. For instance, the fact that all of these migrant laborers did not have any support whatsoever. They couldn't even get back home. Many of them were on the streets actually starving. They didn't have access to food. Therefore, it became the responsibility of the government to feed those migrant laborers, right? Which is when the government actually set into motion and they started providing for food. They started engaging with NGOs to be able to provide adequate food and nutrition to the migrant laborers who were stuck in the cities, who weren't able to go back to the villages. Then the second step was providing them transportation so that they could go back. Now, would they do that to me? Am I entitled to get free food from the government? Am I entitled to get free transportation to go back to my city? Because I come from Bangalore, I'm stuck in Sonipat. Will the government pay me to go back to my city? Obviously not, right? The reason being that the government is treating different populations in a different way based on their needs. I do not need that food. I have sufficient money to take care of myself. I'm a middle class citizen. I'm an earning citizen. I have, even if I have lost my job, I still have sufficient resources to be able to feed me in the least, right? So the government has to approach its populations, different groups, in different manners. So the policies that are applied on the field will once again be very, very contextual. They will be applied to certain groups and not to other groups. For instance, people who are below the poverty line have access to something called the BPL card in our country, which is essentially the below the poverty line card. And then there are those who are just slightly above the poverty line. They get access to another card called the above poverty line card. What is the point of these cards? The point of these cards is that those who have those cards can claim access to subsidized food. I cannot claim access to subsidized food for the simple reason that I do not have this card, because I am not below poverty line, nor am I just above poverty line. So I will not get access to any one of these cards. So the government essentially formulates public policies for different groups of populations based on their needs and based on their status as citizens. Are they able to take care of themselves completely? Are they poor? And therefore, there is a differentiation between different groups of people. So, what is law then, right? So, law, when generally people talk about law in the very commonsensical term, they talk about law as something that is written in a law book. You will generally hear people speaking about the Constitution of India. You will hear people talking about various acts and enactments. For example, you must have heard about the Manrega. Huh? Manrega is the National Rural Employment Generation Act. So what is Manrega? It is a law which was enacted by the government of India. But why was that law enacted? Because the government of India wanted to enforce one of its public policies. So the relationship between public policy and law has, one of the relationships is that when the government takes a certain approach towards a group of people, and in Manrega that pertains to rural employment generation, right? So the public policy approach of the government at that time was that people in the rural part of India are suffering. They do not have jobs, and therefore we need to be able to create sufficient jobs for these people. Now, why create jobs and employment? For the simple reason that in the Constitution, one of the fundamental rights that we have, Article 21, is right to life and liberty. Now, if you need to have life, you need to be living, you should have sufficient monetary resources to survive. You cannot not have, for example, you cannot survive if you do not have money. But how do you get money then? You get money when you get employment. And therefore, you can exercise your right to live, meaning you can live only if you have the adequate financial resources at hand. And to gain these financial resources, you need to have employment. You need to have work in order for it to pay you to be able to live and not die, right? So, so the government is, in a certain sense, its public policy approach or its approach towards various issues is firmly grounded in the Constitution of India. The Constitution has a required set of fundamental rights, which are basic human rights of every individual. And in addition to this, the government has, the Constitution also includes what are called the directive principles of state policy. Now, what are these directive principles of state policy? They are essentially all those principles that are meant to guide the government in its various programs. It could be any sort of public program that the government has launched, including, for instance, all of these, access to subsidized food, ration, right? That's also one of those different programs of the government. It could be through laws such as Manrega, right? So how does so all those principles in the directive principles of state policy are supposed to guide the way in which the government responds or in a certain way engages with its population. And how does it engage with population? In two ways, either through public projects, programs and projects of various sorts, or through laws such as the Manrega, which enforce these projects on the ground. So the Manrega essentially is a law which encapsulates the approach of the government encapsulates the policy of the government towards rural employment generation. So what is the policy? The policy is that we are in a situation where the rural poor are unable to survive because they do not have adequate jobs. And if they are unable to survive, if they suffer from malnutrition, it is a denial of their right to life under the Constitution. They have a right as a citizen to live. And how can they live? They can live only if the government makes it possible for them to have adequate work, right? So the Manrega is just an example of how law and policy actually, one example of how law and policy actually tie into each other. So you, in a certain sense, you can actually have a policy which is implemented through programs, but you can also have a policy which is implemented through laws. Now, what is the difference between these two? The difference is that when you have a program or a project, and most often 90+% of the government's policies are implemented through projects. I'll give you another example. One example is the Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission. I guess you guys must have seen this on, if you are on the street, you would have seen these buses with JNNURM written on them, right? Why is JNNURM written under them? Because these buses have essentially been sponsored under the NERM program. The short form for JNNURM is NERM. So these buses were funded under the NERM program. It was interesting, actually. I mean, the NERM program, provided a huge improvement to transportation. So there was a huge lack of buses and a huge lack of transportation earlier. So what they did was to infuse funds so that states could actually then go and buy a lot more buses and therefore enable people to travel freely and easily through public transportation, through the cheapest mode of transportation, so that the poorest person on the ground, the one who doesn't have a car like you and me, can still travel easily and doesn't have to stand in a bus and wait for hours on end to be able to travel. This reminds me actually of something, a small anecdote. When I started out as a lawyer, I didn't have any mode of transportation. I lived in South Bangalore, and I had to travel to North Bangalore to the courts in order to represent my clients. The office I worked in was the Advocate General's office, which is right next to which is a part of the High Court of Karnataka. So in those days, I had to take 3 buses to get to that point. I had to take one from my house to Jayanagar, and from Jayanagar very often to some other part of the city, and then from there, or sometimes on very good days, I would take two buses and get there. It would take me about an hour and a half to travel from South Bangalore to North Bangalore. Of course, if I had my own vehicle, which I managed to invest in a year after I started working as a lawyer, I managed to take a loan and buy my own two-wheeler. The same transportation would take me about 30 to 35 minutes. So you can imagine that the travel of about 35 minutes would take me about 1.5 hours by bus. But why was this? Simply because there weren't sufficient buses. Because one day that particular bus which comes at that particular time is suddenly spoiled, and there is no other bus to replace that. So therefore, I have to wait for the next bus. And this would happen very frequently. So though I could have left at a certain time to make that journey, even that bus journey could have been made within an hour, but I had to leave earlier because in case this bus does not come, the next one will come and I will take it. So, in terms of time, it's a humongous waste of time and efforts of people on the ground. So these kind of buses that were infused in the NERM were meant to address these kind of shortages that took place on the ground. And after that, people began to see a huge improvement in transportation. Now, let me go back to my question. What is the distinction between implementing a policy through a program like the NERM and implementing the same policy through a law? What is the distinction? The distinction is this, that when the policy is implemented through a program, it is not 100% binding on a particular state to implement it on the ground. Meaning that the state can look at that particular policy and decide, first of all, whether it wants to implement that policy in that state, and if so, in which state. And the state can then decide to partially implement this policy in certain parts of the state and to ignore this policy in other parts of the state. So the powers of the state are phenomenal when it is in the form of a program. The state can also take some part of the funding and implement part of it and then not implement the other part. So the state has, with programs, state has sufficient leeway, sufficient maneuver to say, okay, I will do this, but I will not do that, right? Now, this is not possible once it is enacted as a law. Why is that? Because laws are binding, right? Uh, Excuse me, give me a moment. Uh, I'm being disturbed by somebody at the door. Just give me a moment, please. Yes, I'm sorry for the disturbance. So as I was saying, there is sufficient leeway under a program for the state to implement parts of it, whereas under a law, it is not. Why is that? Because a law becomes binding the moment it is enacted. Why is that? Because it creates certain rights for people on the ground. People can very much go back to the Manrega Act and say, okay, this provides for this, meaning I have a right under this law to a minimum of 100 days of work every year, and my state has not provided it for me, so I can actually go and complain about this in a court of law and demand my right to work. That is really the distinction between enforcing a public policy through a program or through law. Now, this is again, once again, this is just this one element, right? One part of this larger question of law and public policy. I now want to come to to a far more interesting question, which is, one is, law as a tool can implement public policies on the ground very efficiently, and it can therefore be enforced by a court of law, meaning people have recourse to go to a court in case something is not working there under the law as promised, right? In case those promises are not fulfilled. With programs, people cannot really do that, right? For instance, I am living in a part of Bangalore where the buses have not improved at all, right? The number of buses are the same. There are no new NERM buses in my part of Bangalore. I cannot therefore go to the file a writ petition in the High Court and tell the government, well, listen, you have not provided the buses here, provided here, because I don't have a right to do that, right? Against a program. Whereas if it is in a law, I have a right to go to a court of law. So laws, in one relationship that is there between law and public policy, is that the first relation, which is that public policies actually emerge from an existing law, which is the Constitution of India. The second, public policies can be enforced through laws on the ground, right? So that relationship is a very, very interesting relationship. But I don't want to stop at this, because this is so mechanical, right? I mean, everybody knows this. I mean, this is common sense, right? The Constitution has certain rights. Public policies, more or less, are drawn from the Constitution of India, not just from the fundamental rights, but also from the directive principles. And sometimes those public policies can be applied through law and enforced through law. Is that all the story? No. If it was, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. So I want to push this a little bit further, right? And this probably we can discuss a lot more in the discussion session. Is, on the one hand, you see public policies, you see laws, but on the other hand, you see that despite public policies and laws, on the ground, something else is taking place, right? And there is really no way to address this. I will just stop by giving you a very, very interesting example to this. So there is something called funds which the government allocates to the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, to the Dalit, what they call the Dalit and Adivasi communities. Why do they do this? Because these are groups that were historically exploited. These were groups that were historically excluded. They were not provided education at various points of time. They were not given the opportunity to come up. They were not given an equal ground from which they could rise. There was no class mobility. They could not become rich. They could not become wealthy. So the government puts in a lot more effort to bringing up this group of people to the same level as people like us, right? People who don't necessarily, people like me, I would say, people who don't necessarily need an equal ground. They are trying to bring them up to that level. So they are infusing a certain amount of funds for these groups to ensure that that fund goes directly to people who have been excluded or underprivileged. Why is that? Because in villages you will see, and you will see that in cities as well, that there will be a certain part of the village which is so dirty, no sanitation, no water, and all the Dalits are living there. There is another part of the city, the village, in which all the rich people are living, where there is adequate water, sanitation, and all of those things. So the government really said, well, if we want to implement the fundamental rights, we have to do it in such a way that these people have funding which is written in their name. We cannot give funding for the entire village. If we give it for the entire village, it will always go to the richer part of the village. They will get more water taps. They will get more sanitation. They will get more roads. They will get more street lights, whereas the people in this part of the village will suffer. So I'll just give you an example of what has happened to this policy. In 1920, an analysis was done on what is actually happening with the money that has been allocated by the government. So in 2018-2019, the budgetary allocation for scheduled castes was 1,39,660 crores. Guess how much of this was actually spent? 76,801. So how much is it? Almost like a little more than half of the funds which were allocated was actually spent. The question is why, right? When you have almost 1.4 lakh crores which are given to scheduled caste, why has only 76,801 crore been spent? Because something else is happening there, right? Because what policies are being framed is not being followed on the ground. Why is that? Why aren't people following policies of the government? Why aren't people implementing the laws of the government? Now, one step further. Out of the 76,801, only 35,409, which is almost half of those funds which were spent on non-targeted programs. Do you know what the meaning of non-targeted programs is? It means that it is not targeted towards these Dalit populations. It is funds, for instance, that I will say this road is passing through the Dalit part of the village, and so I will put money, I will allocate the Dalit funds for this road. But when you actually go on the ground, you might see that that road might pass through the Dalit part of the village, but not really directly, a little away, right? But it actually serves or benefits the upper caste group in the village. So the whole point of asking them to target these funds to certain communities, on the ground what is happening is people are using those funds but diverting it towards non-targeted programs. Why is this? One answer, one response that I have, and we will have the occasion to discuss this further when we start class, is because we have something called the formal law, right? We have the constitutional law, we have all these acts, amendments, all of this beautiful, paraphernalia of writing which has been produced by the parliament, in which half of the people are most of the time sleeping when these laws are passed. on the one hand, you have that, but on the ground, what takes place is according to a different set of laws in itself, right? So you want to know what those sets of laws are? Well, for that, you'll have to wait until the semester begins. Now, before I finish, I want to come to the scheduled tribes part. The amount that was budgeted is 75 lakh 989 987 987 crores. The amount that was actually spent is 50 lakh 86 crores, and the amount spent on non-targeted groups, non-targeted programs was 29 lakh 919 crores, which is more than half of what was actually spent was spent on non-targeted programs for in the case of the allocations for scheduled tribes. So this is what academics and scholars refer to as alternative law, meaning that on the one hand, you have the laws which the state frames. On the other hand, you have people on the ground who actually are implementing another set of laws and rules, which have another completely a different logic, a different notion of a different idea of what society should be, right? It's not, and that vision of what society should be does not match on to the vision of what society should be as framed in the Indian Constitution. So I'll stop here. We can then, move on to a question and answer session. Are there any questions?
Good morning, ma'am. This is Ishan Misri. I just wanted to I don't know if we have enough time, but you talked about law being a tool to implement policy, one of the tools to implement public policy, right? I wanted to understand, should law be an ultimate or absolute tool to implement policy? What does that tell about our governmental efficiencies? Shouldn't ethically, what is right? Is law as a tool to implement policy is better ethically, or in a project mode wherein government is executively doing whatever it wants to do in policy? Which of the two things are better in long term?
Ishan, that's a fantastic question actually to ask. I thank you for that question, because I've also frequently kept wondering, what is a better route? Does it really make sense for us to have laws, to implement policies? Is it not better to actually leave it to the government to execute these policies in another mechanism? Again, I'll go back to the MNREGA, the NREGA example, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And the reason is because a lot of studies were done after the MNREGA was enacted. They were trying to find out, is it really being implemented on the ground or not? And to no surprise, they found that there were a lot of problems with the implementation of the NREGA. And despite the fact that it is a law, I mean, we tend to think that once it is a law, it becomes binding, it becomes mandatory for a government to implement it. In fact, that's the reason why the NREGA was implemented as a law and not a program. Because the notion was that if you implement it as a program, it will not work. People will not do anything about it. That they will only be another program in the name. And finally, what you will see on the ground is lack of enforcement of that particular program, or a very selective enforcement, where the state can just decide it will enforce it here and not enforce it there. And all of this will be according to calculations of, politics, local politics. Somebody is in power in a particular part, in a particular village, and that person wants that program to be implemented so that he or she can gain a lot of votes from the people there, then that program will be implemented there, right? But there is another village with a Dalit representative or some other representative who doesn't have so much power, then perhaps it will not be implemented in that other part. So remember that policies, once the government comes out with the framework of a policy, now we have the new education policy, right? So there are again lots of debates on what's actually going to happen on the ground. How is it going to be enforced? How is it going to be implemented? The easy part is to actually come out with a policy. I think that is the easiest part. You have a group of people who are sitting and writing it up and researching and looking at various things and then deciding what the policy should be. That is really the easiest part. The toughest and the part where things do not really happen is when it is actually enforced or implemented on the ground. That is really the reason why, for example, in policies such as rural employment, you have Manrega. The idea being that with the law, you can ensure that it is actually enforced or implemented. And then you have studies of the Narega, which actually show you that in many cases it's not done. So you can see that even with a law, there are still problems with implementation, right? And there is a sort of a test on how serious the government is about certain things, right? If the government is really serious about something, it will immediately, it will come out with a policy, but immediately make that into a law. If it is not really serious about something, it will make it into a program, right? And there'll be many exit options in that program for people to maneuver and to, find a way out, right? So in a certain sense, you can make out whether the government is very, very serious in the manner in which it implements policies, in the manner in which it frames policies, either as programs or as laws. On the other hand, you realize that even laws have serious shortcomings, right? So if somebody is not adequately paid, which is a big problem under the Narega, that there are a lot of people in between who eat up a lot of the money which is supposed to be paid to the people after they have worked, then what do? People have to again take recourse to law. But then what recourse are they going to take? They're going to apply to a court. They're going to stand there and wait for 5 years or 10 years until the court actually decides what to do with it. So with this legal system that is once again chugging along, which is not really as responsive as it needs to be, you see that there are also problems even with implementing a policy through a law.
Ma'am, I would also like to add that I've also worked in a legislative drafting policy regarding anti-stalking laws and all. I realized working while there that converting a policy into a law-based structure, it is also kind of limiting in itself, because it doesn't give you the place to easily course correct the policy if we see that. So I really don't feel good when laws are being used to implement policy. So that was my point only.
Yeah, I mean, see, the Narega has course corrected several times despite it being a law, right?
Yeah, but
so law is not really a very hard and fast tool. It can be amended in minutes with an amending act, right? With an amendment act.
Yeah, 368 and all that.
Yeah, Narega has actually been course corrected several times.
I was saying it from the perspective for the field work. There's whenever we're doing something on field, when doing some project in field.
No, I understand your point completely. No, it's about flexibility, right?
Yeah, flexibility.
Yeah, that I understand, but I'm just telling you that it's not that law doesn't have course correction; it has it, right?
Yeah, it can be cumbersome. That's my point. Yeah. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay. Are there other questions? Pranav?
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon. Ma'am, after working on an internship with the government of Rajasthan, the one point where I realized is that often they try to conceal the reality.
Okay.
And, It may not be the case in every state government and hopefully not in the union government. But I practically stormed in my mind saying that you guys are definitely going to lose the elections, which they eventually did. So why does it happen that, okay, politicians can be electoral minded, but why do bureaucrats have to be the same way? Because as far as I know, they are protected under the hand and seal of the president. So they don't
Yes.
have to worry about the same.
Yes, but so remember that they are not isolated from the political configurations there. In fact, they're very much influenced by local politics. They can be transferred within minutes of doing something that can tick somebody off. So the bureaucracy is not immune from the political scenario in that particular area. So they are also very, very much vulnerable in a certain sense to political action of various sorts and on various grounds. And then it can very easily be written off, right, as an officer who was not doing what he was meant to do, right? It can be rephrased, and they can rely on all kinds of things to make a case against him. So they are not immune.
And ma'am, another short question was that when we were talking about the language of the law,
Yeah.
so the constitution serves as a prototype of the same, that the language is far too complex to be understood at once if one tries to look at it. And despite reading English for 18 years, my mind was dumbfounded when I read it for the first time in detail. So, how do we help in simplifying such a complex document, which in essence cannot be simplified?
I wouldn't say it cannot be simplified. I'll just give you one example of what I used to do when I was a lawyer. So I told you how I worked with the Advocate General, and during court vacations, we would have say about 15 days, 10 to 15 days often during court vacations. And what I did was to connect to a local NGO to work with them on, actually simplifying the law, making it easy for people to really understand what their different rights are under different legal provisions. And I used to do a range of what you would call legal empowerment sessions. So this would range from, for instance, what are your rights against domestic violence and what can you do in case of domestic violence? What are the different kinds of evidence that you need to be able to collect and keep in your favor? Everything, right? The complete one-on-one translation of law into a very easy, understandable format. To even rights on arrest, for example, if somebody just arbitrarily walks in, which happens very often in slums, right? There are officers who just arbitrarily walk in and will pick up somebody and walk out, right? What do you do if there's somebody in your family who's being picked up? How do you address them? Do you just keep quiet? Do you let them arrest them, or do you respond to them and tell them, well, listen, I know something about law, right? To be able to also teach them the language of the law in a very simple manner. And this is just one example I'm giving, and there are a lot of people who are doing much more work on this. This is something that I did very, very part-time way back in my lawyer days. But there are NGOs, for instance, and even civil society activists, advocacy people who do this kind of work on a regular basis.
Yes.
Thanks, Pranav. Very good questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thanks. Okay, so we have Nayanika Mishra who has raised a hand. Nayanika?
Hello, ma'am.
Hi, Nayanika.
I just wanted to ask, you talked about fund allocation and how it doesn't reach half of the less than half of the funds reach the targeted groups.
Yeah.
So is there no compulsion on the allocated funds to completely be spent on the groups, or any transparency about how it is being spent?
There is a compulsion. They are meant to spend every rupee of this amount. So what I read to you right now was 2018-19, right? I did a lot of field work in Bangalore between 2009 and 2015. At which time I met a lot of people, especially Dalit activists on the ground. And at that point of time, it was even worse. That point of time, in fact, that Dalit Adivasi fund used to be kept in a separate bank account. And the interest from that funds used to be allocated towards programs which had nothing to do with Dalit groups, which were not targeted towards any Dalit group. And the state was actually refusing to spend those funds. They had just kept them there. And these Dalit activists were up in arms, trying very hard to get them to release those funds, get them to actually use those funds. Very few constituencies, I even visited a few, in one which was close to the then airport in Bangalore, on Marathahalli Road, where there was one really exceptional case where that funds were actually being channeled and used on the ground to. So I remember, visiting that, because it was one of those cases where funds were actually being used for the Dalit community. And I wanted to find out whether it was actually being used for the Dalit community or if it was being used for other groups. And then I realized that they were actually using it for housing programs. They were building homes for the Dalit groups there, close to the Marathahalli main road. So I'm actually very happy you asked me this question, because this question of compulsion is really at the core of my my attempt to get you guys to really ask yourselves questions about law, right? Because on the one hand, you can have the constitution, you can have another law like the Narega or any other law which tells you to do certain things in certain ways. On the other hand, you have a different set of norms. I mean, generally people talk of this as norms on the ground, right? What are these norms? These are, in scholarly articles, they talk about it as social norms. Some of the scholarly articles also talk of it as legal norms, right? What are these norms? These are actually understandings or set of ideas on what should actually take place on the ground. And very often you see that those norms are much, much more stronger than the formal law that has been enforced. Which is why a lot of people who are observing laws and their enforcement on the ground, there's a huge group of legal anthropologists who essentially study this. Why is it that the law says this and something else is happening on the ground? They say that this is something they term as alternative law, meaning that this is a law which is not written in the way the Constitution is written. It is not a law which is written in that complex language as mentioned earlier, in that language which nobody can understand, right? It is not that kind of law. It is a different law itself, which is unwritten, which is a sort of an understanding of how things should be on the ground, and people carry it out, right? So why is it that people who are compelled to spend this money are not spending it? Because they don't believe they have to spend it, right? Because there is an inherent discrimination against the Dalit groups. So when they are compelled to spend it, they spend only half of that amount, or sometimes most often less than half of that amount by compulsion. And even what they spend, a good amount of what they are spending is spent on non-targeted programs, which means that their belief really is that fund should not go to that particular group, but it should go somewhere else, right? So these are actually what legal anthropologists call alternative legalities. And our common sense way of thinking about law is to say, which act was it? Is it in the Constitution? Which set of regulations, and where are these, is this set of regulations linked to which act is it linked to, right? And we generally have a very small, narrow-minded view of what law is. But people who are studying how these things are, which are meant to be enforced, are not enforced, are talking about something completely different. It is an alternative legality, meaning an alternative legal system that people construct on the ground, which is then very, very strong, so strong that it can even withstand what the Constitution says. It can say, no, we are not going to do what you want us to do. We are not going to do what you compel us to do, right? So this compulsion is less compelling. It is less stronger than the compulsion on the field to not allocate those funds.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome. Thank you for your question. I think we have another question.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Tejasvi Panjiyar.
Good.
Yes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Is this Tejasvi Panjiyar?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah,
Okay.
please go ahead.
So, ma'am, this observation that I have.
1 minute, Tejasvi. Let me just say, I think somebody spoke in between. Who was that? Can you just raise your hand so then I will come one by one?
Ma'am, it's me. My name is Sandeep.
Who's this?
I am Anil, actually, ma'am.
Anil. Okay, so then please raise your hand so that I can, call out your name. Okay?
Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am.
Okay. Tejasvi, go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. So, ma'am, we talked about implementation issues and enforcement issues. Another issue I feel that laws have, which public policies may not be having, is that laws are not, sometimes because we have such an old constitution, they are archaic and they are sometimes not consistent with the new ideals of constitutional morality. They might get obsolete with time, which essentially does not work towards removing inequities in our society. Whereas public policy has a more dynamic nature, since it has it does essentially exactly serve the changing needs of a society. So
okay. Yeah, Tejasvi, that's very interesting. Do you want to continue? You want to say something else?
that was my observation, actually. I wanted your comment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're right. It's a very good, very solid observation, obviously grounded in some understanding of the law. Yes, yeah, the manner in which you think about law is that it is something that is pretty static. In the Indian scenario, you are 100% right. Look at our laws. We have laws from the 1700s, 1800s. They are from a completely different day and age, right? So yes, there is a I think Ishan was also referring to this, right, when he was talking. There is an element of law which is pretty static, meaning that it's very hard to change laws. Whereas it is much more easier to have policy changes on the field. I think that's a very good observation. Both Ishan and you are pointing to something that is, because obviously if you want to change a law, you need to have the Amendment Act passed in the Parliament. Otherwise, you can't change it, right? Whereas policy modifications can be made much more easily. Yes, I agree with you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sorry to interrupt, ma'am. I just wanted to give an example. The Right Now Epidemic Act is Ishan, ma'am. It's Ishan.
Ishan, can you, if you don't mind, can I go on to the other person, because there are people who are raising their hands and we are almost out of time.
Okay. Sorry, ma'am. Yeah? Sorry to interrupt. So
yeah,
apologies.
but I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you once we start classes. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Who is this now? Is this I think Purva now? Purva Israni, and then Anil also wanted to say something. Is he there? Has he raised his hand?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I'm here.
Okay, Anil, please raise your hand on the things so that you come up next, and then Purva, go ahead.
Okay, ma'am. After Purva, I will go.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
Ma'am, my question is related to the subject of health. Health being an important field, why is it included in the state list and not in the concurrent list? Because there's a debate going on currently on this. So my question, I was wondering on this, that why is it not included in the concurrent list? Is it because that there's a problem of overlapping, or are there any conflict of interests when it comes to health related policies?
See, the matters which are listed in the state list are meant to be executed by the state for the simple reason that these are issues that the state can do more efficiently, right?
Yes.
The state can actually, but then there are many things on the state list which are on the concurrent list, meaning that both the state and the central government can also take, implement certain programs within the state list on certain issues. So very frequently you will also find overlaps in these programs. For instance, many of the health schemes which are launched by the central government, they are not launched under the state list, but they are launched under specific policies and programs. And once again, channelize funds to the state. So there are many, for instance, even the NARM that I spoke about. Hello? I can.
Yes, ma'am.
There was some disturbance, wasn't there? Yeah. Okay. So you understand what I'm saying. So NARM, for example, NARM is also, it's transportation, right? All of these infrastructure, transportation, urban development, both the state and the central can actually. So there are many items like that which are on both the list. Health is not there in the concurrent list. Well, but then you can also have schemes, particular health schemes, through which funds are allocated under the central budget to the state.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I think Anil wanted to go after this.
Yes, ma'am, I can.
Yes.
Can I?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. I want to ask, actually, even after implementing a program in India, I think it is much difficult to continuously maintain it in India, actually. For this, I want to give an example. Suppose during the Make in India concept, there were thousands of RO purified filters that have been fitted into the railway stations, and even people loving it. But in the starting, people are loving it, everything they are doing it. But nowadays, if you see, nowadays they are not being maintained. Most of them are just logged, and people are again switching to the mineral waters. They are shifting to that. So what is that? How to maintain that? That is, I think, a bigger problem in India. Even after it has been implemented, it has not been properly maintained. And that's where it is lacking now. Even after investing so much money into those,
Yes.
even after installing so much thing, that is being completely waste nowadays.
Yes, I see, Anil. That's the thing, right? I mean, you're pointing to a very important question, which is that once you implement a policy and something even seems to be successful, it is not maintained. That it doesn't continue that way. It doesn't continue to exist. For this, I think there are several reasons that could be possible, right? It depends on how, first of all, on how funds are channeled to the ground. What I suggest is, if you guys are interested to look at some of the reports of the Center for Policy Research in Delhi, CPR, they come out with very, very interesting reports on how exactly there are problems, how funds which are allocated at either the central government level or even within states, there is a difficulty in actually accessing those funds on the ground. That sometimes it takes so long for funds to filter down to the ground that by the time it goes there, it is no longer relevant anymore. So Yamini Iyer does a good amount of work on this. I suggest you check out some of her talks on YouTube. There is one talk where she's focusing primarily on allocation, on funds, on how funds flow, right? And that is really one of the principal reasons why you see that several of these policies or programs which begin later on do not succeed. This one on RO, I am not really sure why it has failed. So, having said that, There may be several reasons why these policies are not continued, or that even if they are continued, we do not see them working on the ground. There are also, what I want you to notice here is that there are specific local issues as well, right? So it's not just about money being allocated, but it's also about people on the ground actually finding an incentive to adopt these policies and make them applicable on the ground. There you will find also maybe that these RO water works in certain parts but doesn't work in other parts. Again, there has to be some sort of a bridging mechanism between the policy itself and its enforcement on the field, and that's where our country lacks. But all of this, once again, let me be very honest, it's not right for us to make generalizations. Every policy is different. Every scheme, every project, every policy, every law is distinct from each other. So even as we are saying, you know, when policies are like this, they are like that, we must understand that the reasons can be very different in different cases and different policies. My invitation is that when you join the public policy school from the 1st of next month, that you actually go beyond some of these abstract debates to actually pick one policy like this and to go deep within it and understand what is going wrong in this policy, right? When you do that, you can probably get a pulse of what is happening or what is probably happening with other policies on other issues as well. So it is really this kind of critical engagement, but also very profound, in-depth engagement with one particular example of a policy that you can take, you know, turn it upside down, look at how it is, where is the money coming from, how does it flow, where does it go, who receives it, who is meant to implement it on the ground. It is really this kind of policy analysis that is required to be able to set right what we see in India. And for that's the reason why we have you here in our policy school. That's why we have all of you students who are enrolled with us, so that you can go out there after your education and turn things around.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks. Are there other questions?
Hello, ma'am.
Yes, who's this? Sandeep? Lalit, can I take a last question if you don't mind? Lalit?
I'm sure. Sure, ma'am.
Yeah, Sandeep, go ahead. I think Lalit said yes. Go ahead. Yes. Good afternoon, Sandeep.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Ma'am, my question is, related to some of the recent developments. I don't know whether it is being related, whether it is being related to law and institution, but given the current challenging situation of COVID-19, how do you think multilateral institutions, would impact the balance of being an independent institution, despite being political hardship? Why I'm raising this question, I can give you some of the examples, like many have questioned the responsibility of World Health Organization of not recognizing the pandemic earlier. Many have questioned that they are being inclined to Chinese money. And back in India, many eminent persons have questioned the responsibility of the highest court, which are being more more authoritative or being more executive. So, ma'am, do we need more strong institutional mechanisms to tackle the post-COVID-19 social consequences? Would there be any reform in regulatory norms that we can think of?
Okay, Sandeep, thank you very much for that question. I think that's a very important part of what also we will discuss in class in law and public policy, which is this that this alternative laws, and there are parallel systems of legal mechanisms that are governing us today, right? When we talk about COVID, for instance, the WHO and what it says is extremely important because it is an international organization. It is an organization which has the backing of several member states, several nation states in the world. And it is an organization that is meant to provide some sort of policy support and advisory to countries, and it has failed. It has failed miserably. It has failed miserably at the very first level in preventing the spread of the virus. Because in the very beginning, the stance that WHO took was that there was no fear, that it was not animal-human transmission, that it was not being transmitted to humans, and therefore nobody had nothing to fear. And they were obviously succumbing to pressure from the Chinese government. This is how, you know, I've worked with UNICEF for some time in my in the past. I've worked with UNICEF New York as well as with UNICEF Geneva in my past. And during my work, in fact, when I was in Graduate Institute, I did a lot of work with UNICEF Geneva because it was close by, because I had friends, and I would frequently get small bits of work which I could do during the vacation as a student to increase my income, especially during my master's education. My scholarship was not as comfortable as my PhD scholarship. So I worked frequently with UNICEF to be able to better sustain myself. And I observed that, the UN system, all of this multilateral agencies that you're talking about, they all need funds. They all actually are funded by countries in the world. And very often they sway in this direction or the other direction based on the kind of funding they receive from countries. So much so that even recruitment within these organizations is largely based on the funding they receive, which is why if you walk into an UN organization, you will see a substantial part of that organization is, has recruited people from the developed part of the world, far more than the developing part of the world. And of course, there are attempts to change that now. There are lots of attempts. But it's common knowledge that people from the developing part of the world have to struggle much, much harder to be able to get in there, right? To be able to get a job over there. That's because of the funding. Because when countries fund, they fund with certain constraints. They're called conditionalities, meaning that if I provide X amount of money, X number of people hired out of so many people on this project should be people from my country, people of this nationality, right? So that's the manner in which funding is also distributed within these organizations. And obviously, when you're taking money from countries, you're bound to also sway depending on where you see more money coming in the future, which is exactly what has happened here in the WHO case. Having said that, I think these organizations, the WHO, obviously, it's a case where there is a lot of lot of alarm which has been raised by the international community, and a lot of people are showing their absolute disgust and disregard to the WHO, and that is bound to change governance within these multilateral agencies as well. This is not going to go unnoticed because China is not the only country in the world which is funding the WHO. Germany funds it, France funds it. In fact, the developed part of the world, the Western part of the world are solid when it comes to funding to these organizations. The United States funds it, and of course, Donald Trump withdrew funding from the WHO. All of these are then again bound to push these multilateral agencies to rethink the manner in which they have responded in this crisis. And though the fact is that this is done and we are bearing the consequences of this, but this will not be forgotten. This will definitely have to result in some sort of an uphaul of this entire system itself.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks, Sandeep. I hope that was a good 30 minutes of discussion. I hope all of you enjoyed it. I'm sorry we have come to the end of this session. It was really nice to talk to a lot of you, and I'm looking forward to all of your questions. In fact, maybe day one, law and public policy, we'll start with this topic once again. And those of you who weren't able to raise your hands and ask questions, please note down your questions, and we'll see each other on, I think on this 1st or 2nd, I think 1st of September already we have the first class. So we'll see each other as soon as the semester begins. Thank you and have a nice day. Thank you very much for listening to me. And thank you to all of those who asked those wonderful questions. Thank you.